The dust hung thick in the air that Sunday morning, suspended like memory itself between the parched Texas earth and a sky so vast it seemed to contain all the loneliness of the world. Thomas Whitmore stood at the edge of Camp McCoy, his weathered hands gripping a worn Bible, watching as the first trucks rumbled through the gates carrying their cargo of broken men who had once been enemies. The year was 1943, and the war in the Pacific raged with a ferocity that had transformed young men into monsters and monsters back into men again, though the boundaries between these states remained uncertain, fluid as the heat that shimmered above the distant highway. He had volunteered for this duty not out of any particular sense of righteousness but because his own son lay buried somewhere in the Solomon Islands, and he found that hatred, when you held it too long, became unbearably heavy. The Japanese prisoners who emerged from those trucks moved with a peculiar dignity that surprised him, their eyes downcast not entirely from shame but from something else, something he couldn't yet name. They had been told to expect death, or worse, the Americans who had been painted in their minds as demons who would tear them apart, consume their spirits, leave nothing but emptiness where once there had been men. Instead they found themselves in this strange liminal space, this camp in the heart of Texas where the sky stretched on forever and the people spoke in drawling cadences that sounded nothing like the barking orders they had anticipated. Whitmore watched as they lined up for processing, each face a story written in languages he couldn't read, each set of shoulders carrying burdens he could only imagine. In those early weeks, silence became the dominant language of the camp, a silence so profound it seemed to have texture and weight. The prisoners moved through their days like ghosts inhabiting a world that didn't quite believe in them, performing tasks that seemed designed to fill time rather than accomplish anything meaningful. They repaired fences that didn't need repairing, moved stones from one place to another and then back again, swept dust that would resettle before their brooms had been put away. The American guards watched them with expressions that ranged from curiosity to lingering anger to something approaching pity, and in those early days, the distance between captive and captor seemed insurmountable, an ocean wider than the Pacific itself. But Thomas Whitmore had learned something about silence during the long months after his son's death, had discovered that within it existed not merely absence but possibility. He began his Sundays by walking through the camp before dawn, moving among the barracks where men slept fitfully or lay awake contemplating futures that seemed increasingly uncertain. He didn't pray exactly, not in the traditional sense, but rather opened himself to whatever might pass between human souls when language failed. It was during one of these walks that he encountered Hiroshi Tanaka, a former schoolteacher from Osaka who had been drafted into service and captured on Saipan, who stood alone watching the sunrise with an expression that Whitmore recognized immediately as the face of someone trying to remember who they had been before the war had remade them. They didn't speak that first morning, just stood together as the light changed from purple to pink to gold, as the world performed its daily miracle of renewal despite everything that had happened and continued to happen. But something passed between them in that silence, some recognition that transcended the arbitrary categories of enemy and ally, captor and captive. When Whitmore finally moved away to continue his rounds, he felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of his son's death had shifted imperceptibly, not disappeared but distributed differently across his shoulders. The idea came to him during the sermon that Sunday, as Reverend Patterson spoke about the stranger who might be an angel unaware, about the radical hospitality that formed the cornerstone of their faith. Whitmore looked around the small wooden church where his family had worshipped for 3 generations, at the familiar faces marked by their own losses and fears, and wondered whether any of them would understand what he was about to propose. His wife Mary caught his eye from across the aisle and gave him that look she'd perfected over 30 years of marriage, the one that meant she already knew what foolishness he was contemplating and had decided to support him anyway. God help them both. He approached the camp commander on Monday morning, a young colonel from Maryland who seemed perpetually exhausted by the weight of responsibilities he hadn't anticipated when he'd accepted this posting. The colonel listened to Whitmore's proposal with an expression that cycled through disbelief, concern, and finally a kind of weary curiosity. To invite Japanese prisoners to Sunday church services in town, to sit beside them in the pews, to share coffee and cookies afterward in the fellowship hall, it seemed not merely unconventional but potentially dangerous, a breach of so many unspoken rules about how enemies were supposed to behave toward one another. Yet something in Whitmore's steady gaze, in the quiet conviction of his voice, made the colonel pause. Perhaps it was the recognition that in this strange interlude, in this space between battles where men existed suspended between identities, different rules might apply. The first Sunday that prisoners were invited, only 3 accepted, including Hiroshi Tanaka. They rode in the back of a truck with 2 guards, moving through the Texas landscape that must have seemed utterly alien to them, past ranches and oil derricks and fields of cotton that stretched toward horizons they couldn't quite believe existed. The church members had been prepared, or so they thought, but preparation proved inadequate for the reality of sitting beside men who might have killed their sons or brothers, whose compatriots had destroyed Pearl Harbor and ravaged the Pacific. Yet as the organ began to play and Reverend Patterson's voice rose in welcome, something shifted in the air, some membrane that had separated them grew temporarily permeable. Hiroshi Tanaka stood with his Bible held uncertainly, the English words swimming before his eyes like fish he couldn't quite catch. He had been Christian once, in his youth, before the militarists had made such affiliations dangerous, had attended services in a small church in Osaka where the hymns had been sung in Japanese and the message had seemed designed for a different world than the one that eventually swallowed him. Now, standing in his foreign church among people whose language he barely understood, he felt something crack open inside him, some container that had been holding all the contradictions of his existence sealed tight. The elderly woman beside him, whose name tag read Mrs. Henderson, offered him her hymnal and pointed to the English words, humming the melody so he might follow along, and in that small gesture he encountered a form of grace he hadn't known still existed. The coffee hour afterward proved more challenging than the service itself, the silence punctuated by awkward attempts at conversation, questions about the weather and the food in camp, safe topics that skirted around the enormous fact of their shared circumstances. But Thomas Whitmore had learned to read silences, and he noticed how young Billy Morrison, barely 18 and 4F due to his flat feet, brought cookies to each of the prisoners with a shy smile that transcended language. He noticed how Mrs. Henderson showed Hiroshi photographs of her grandson, killed at Iwo Jima, and instead of the expected bitterness, something like shared grief passed between them, 2 people who had lost too much to maintain the purity of their hatred. Word spread through the camp that the church visits were not tricks or traps but something genuine, something that defied the logic of war. More prisoners began accepting the invitations, 5 the next week, then 8, then 12. They would dress in the simple clothes provided by the Red Cross, would climb into the trucks with expressions of nervous anticipation, would file into the small church that seemed to expand to accommodate them. Reverend Patterson adjusted his sermons, speaking more slowly, choosing stories over abstract theology, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, narratives that worked in any language because they addressed the universal architecture of the human heart. Kenji Yamamoto had been an engineer before the war, had designed bridges that connected islands, that allowed people to move between spaces that had previously been isolated. Now he found himself constructing a different kind of bridge, translating not just words but the emotional content beneath them for his fellow prisoners who struggled with English. He would whisper running commentary during the sermons, would explain that when Mrs. Henderson asked about their families she wasn't interrogating them but expressing genuine interest, would help them navigate the minefield of American small talk where "how are you?" didn't really require an honest answer. In this role he discovered a purpose he hadn't felt since his capture, since the moment when surrender had seemed to strip away everything he thought defined him as a man. The transformation happened slowly, incrementally, in moments too small to seem significant individually but which accumulated into something undeniable. Private Henderson, whose brother had been killed in the Philippines, found himself laughing at something Kenji had said about the terrible coffee they served in camp, both of them bonding over the universal soldiers' complaint about institutional beverages. Mrs. Patterson began baking extra pies on Saturday nights, rectangular ones that would fit in the truck that transported the prisoners, and she would hand them over with instructions about how they should be shared fairly, as if these men were still capable of fairness, as if the war hadn't taught them that survival often required abandoning such niceties. Hiroshi began to teach English lessons in camp, informal sessions where prisoners gathered to learn not just vocabulary but the cultural nuances that would help them navigate these unexpected interactions. He explained about Texas hospitality, how the offers of food and conversation weren't strategic maneuvers but cultural imperatives, ways of acknowledging shared humanity that transcended political circumstances. He He taught them phrases beyond the utilitarian military English they'd been required to learn, taught them how to say thank you with the proper emotional inflection, how to ask about someone's day and actually care about the answer, how to exist in a space of genuine exchange rather than mere transaction. The summer heat that year was particularly brutal, the kind of heat that made rational thought difficult, that reduced everything to the immediate imperative of finding shade and water. The prisoners worked in the fields sometimes, helping local farmers whose sons were overseas, whose crops needed harvesting regardless of global conflicts. Thomas Whitmore watched from the church as these small groups moved through the cotton fields, Japanese men and Texas farmers working side by side, communicating through gestures and broken phrases, finding ways to collaborate despite everything that should have made such collaboration impossible. He thought about his son, wondered what small kindnesses might have been extended to him before the end, whether some Japanese civilian had offered him water or shade, whether in those final moments there had been any recognition of shared humanity. Mary Whitmore had been skeptical initially, had worried that her husband's grief was driving him towards some form of elaborate self-punishment or perhaps a dangerous naivety about human nature. But watching these men file into church each Sunday, seeing how they listened to the sermons with an intensity that suggested they were searching for something they'd lost, she began to understand that her husband wasn't being naive but rather was operating from a deeper wisdom than she'd credited. She started bringing extra food to the fellowship hours, would seek out the quieter prisoners who stood at the margins, would ask them about their lives before the war in ways that acknowledged they had been more than soldiers, more than enemies. Takeshi Sato had been the most resistant to the church visits, had argued that accepting American hospitality was a form of betrayal, that maintaining distance and dignity required refusing these overtures. He would stand apart during the fellowship hours, arms crossed, expression closed, determined to prove that he at least could not be softened by cookies and kind words. But Mrs. Henderson was relentless in a gentle way that proved impossible to resist. She would bring him coffee prepared exactly as he'd mentioned liking at one unguarded moment, would ask about the books he was reading without expecting lengthy responses, would simply sit beside him in comfortable silence when words failed. Gradually, imperceptibly, his resistance eroded not because she defeated it but because maintaining it required more energy than he possessed. The fall brought cooler weather and a shift in the quality of light, autumn in Texas being less about leaves changing color than about the angle of sun and the way shadows lengthened differently across the land. The war in the Pacific intensified, news of battles and casualties arriving with regular inevitability, and in the church each Sunday there existed this strange bubble where such news felt simultaneously immediate and distant, as if they were occupying a space adjacent to the war rather than embedded within it. Reverend Patterson preached about peace without being pacifist, about justice without being vengeful, about maintaining one's humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away, and his words hung in the air like prayers awaiting answers that might never come. It was during one of these autumn Sundays that something unexpected happened, one of those moments that revealed the fragility of the peace they'd constructed. A new guard, recently transferred from a camp in California where conditions had been harder and attitudes less forgiving, objected to the prisoners being given coffee before he'd had his, objected in language that was harsh and dehumanizing, that reminded everyone present that beneath the veneer of civility existed the raw facts of power and captivity. The silence that followed was terrible, pregnant with the possibility of violence or at minimum a return to the emotional distance they'd been gradually overcoming. But Thomas Whitmore stepped forward with his own cup, offered it to the guard with a smile that somehow managed to be both gentle and firm, and said quietly that there was plenty for everyone, that scarcity was a lie they didn't need to believe. The guard took the cup, looked around at the faces watching him, American and Japanese both, and something in him relented, some defensive posture softened, and the moment passed, though its echo would linger. Hiroshi began writing letters home, carefully censored missives that couldn't convey the complexity of what he was experiencing but which tried nonetheless to communicate that he was being treated humanely, that he had encountered unexpected kindness, that the Americans were not the demons they'd been led to believe. He didn't know if these letters would ever reach his family, didn't know if his wife and children had survived the bombings that he'd heard had devastated Japanese cities, but writing gave him a way to maintain connection with the person he'd been before the war, before the surrender, before this strange interlude in Texas had begun to remake him. The Christmas season approached with its own complications, the question of how to celebrate a holiday that meant different things to different people, that carried religious significance for some and cultural weight for others. Reverend Patterson proposed a service that would honor multiple traditions, that would acknowledge the prisoners' backgrounds while welcoming them into this Christian celebration. The church was decorated not just with traditional evergreens and nativity scenes but with origami cranes that the prisoners had folded, hundreds of them in colors that caught the light, symbols of peace that seemed almost painfully hopeful given the circumstances. When the choir sang Silent Night, Hiroshi stood and began singing in Japanese, the same hymn he'd learned as a young man, and gradually other voices joined his, Japanese and English words interweaving, creating something that belonged entirely to that moment and could never be replicated. Mary Whitmore watched her husband during that service, saw tears running down his weathered face, and understood that he was simultaneously mourning his son and celebrating these men's survival, holding grief and joy together in his heart because real life required such contradictions, such capacity for multiple truths. She reached across the pew and took his hand, and they sat together listening to this impossible choir, this gathering of people who shouldn't have been able to create harmony but somehow did. The winter brought its own rhythms, the prisoners now integrated enough into the Sunday routine that their presence felt natural rather than novel. They helped set up chairs before services, assisted with cleanup afterward, contributed to the potluck dinners that marked special occasions. Kenji found himself in conversations with local engineers about bridge design, discussions that touched on technical specifications but ranged into philosophy, into questions about what it meant to build things that would outlast the builders, that would serve purposes the designers couldn't fully anticipate. Private Henderson discovered that Takashi shared his interest in photography, and they would spend time after services looking at pictures, discussing composition and light, finding common language in the visual grammar that transcended their different experiences. News reached the camp in early 1945 that the war in Europe had ended, and the subsequent celebration was complicated for everyone involved. The prisoners understood that Japan's situation was growing more desperate, that their nation was being pushed back on all fronts, that the likelihood of returning home to anything resembling the Japan they'd left was diminishing daily. Yet they joined in the church's prayers for peace, for an end to all the dying, even as those prayers implied their nation's defeat. Thomas Whitmore, leading the service that day, spoke about the difference between nationalism and patriotism, about loving one's country enough to want it to stop doing harm, and his words were directed at everyone present, a reminder that moral complexity didn't respect national boundaries. The summer of 1945 brought unbearable heat and news that seemed to prefigure some approaching climax. The prisoners felt it, a change in the air that suggested their time in this strange liminal space was approaching its end. When word came of Hiroshima, then Nagasaki, the Japanese men in Camp McCoy experienced something beyond grief, a kind of existential devastation that recognized not just death but a fundamental rupture in reality itself. The church that Sunday was full of Americans uncertain how to respond, how to mourn cities destroyed while simultaneously feeling relief that perhaps the war would finally end, that their own sons and brothers might survive after all. Reverend Patterson spoke about the valley of the shadow of death, about walking through darkness without being consumed by it, and his words felt inadequate against the magnitude of what had happened, yet they were the only words available, the small human language they had to describe events that exceeded human scale. Hiroshi sat in his usual pew, feeling the weight of Mrs. Henderson's hand on his shoulder, a gesture that communicated something beyond sympathy, beyond even empathy, something closer to shared recognition of tragedy so vast it belonged to everyone. He thought about his students in Osaka, wondered how many had survived, wondered what world they would inherit from this catastrophe that the adults had created and failed to stop. He thought about how he'd taught them to read English poetry, how he'd believed that literature could build bridges between cultures, and he didn't know whether to laugh or weep at his own naivety, at the way the world had demonstrated how easily such bridges could be destroyed. When Japan surrendered in August, the celebration in town was exuberant, people flooding into the streets with relief and joy that the long nightmare was finally ending. At Camp McCoy, the mood was more subdued, the prisoners processing their defeat with the complicated emotions of men who had never entirely believed in the war but had fought in it nonetheless, who felt both relief that the killing would stop and shame that their nation had been humbled. That Sunday, Thomas Whitmore stood before a congregation that included more prisoners than ever before, nearly 40 of them filling the back pews, and he spoke not about victory or defeat but about the work of rebuilding, about how the hardest work was always the work of reconstruction, of learning to live together after you tried to destroy each other. The months that followed were strange, an interregnum where the prisoners remained in camp but with the understanding that eventually they would be repatriated, would return to a Japan that had been transformed utterly by fire and defeat. The Sunday services continued, became in some ways even more important as a space where the question of what came next could be contemplated together. Kenji began teaching some of the Americans basic Japanese, not the military phrases they'd needed during the war but the language of daily life, how to greet someone properly, how to apologize with the appropriate depth of feeling, how to express gratitude in ways that acknowledged the weight of what had been given. Mrs. Henderson announced that she was compiling a cookbook, recipes from both American and Japanese traditions, a document that would preserve what they'd learned from each other during these years. The prisoners contributed dishes their mothers had made, meals that represented not military Japan but the Japan of family dinners and festivals, of daily life before the war had consumed everything. The American women shared their own family recipes, pies and casseroles that carried their own histories, their own stories of survival and community. The resulting cookbook was a strange hybrid document, measurements converted between systems, ingredients substituted based on availability, but it represented something important, a record of the fact that they had tried to understand each other, had succeeded at least partially in creating something together. Takeshi, who had been so resistant initially, found himself the most reluctant to leave, having discovered in this Texas town something he hadn't expected to find anywhere, especially not in a prison camp, a sense of being seen as a full human being rather than merely as an enemy or a category. Mrs. Henderson had worn down his defenses so completely that he found himself helping her in her garden, learning the names of Texas plants, discovering that his hands remembered how to cultivate life rather than just destroy it. She would talk to him about her grandson, about the boy's love of adventure stories and his terrible singing voice, and Takeshi would listen with the attention of someone being trusted with something precious, understanding that she was giving him not just stories but a piece of her grief, allowing him to carry some of its weight. The final Sunday before the first group of prisoners was scheduled for repatriation, Reverend Patterson asked Hiroshi to speak to the congregation, to share his perspective on what these years had meant. Hiroshi stood before them, hands trembling slightly, and spoke in heavily accented but clear English about the ways they had all been changed, about how he had come to Texas expecting death or cruelty and had found instead a kind of salvation he hadn't been looking for, hadn't thought he deserved. He spoke about how the war had taught him that human beings were capable of immense cruelty, but that these Sundays had reminded him they were also capable of immense grace, that maybe the point of being human was existing in the tension between these possibilities, choosing grace whenever possible even when cruelty seemed easier or more justified. When he finished, the silence that followed was profound, not empty but full, charged with the emotion of people recognizing truth when they heard it. Then Mrs. Henderson stood and began clapping, and others joined her, and soon the entire church was on its feet applauding, and the prisoners were crying and the Americans were crying, and Reverend Patterson had to pause the service because no one could sing through their tears, and it didn't matter because the applause was its own kind of hymn, its own prayer for a better world than the one they'd been given. The departures, when they came, were wrenching in ways that surprised everyone. These men who had been enemies, who by all rights should have been glad to be free of each other, found themselves exchanging addresses with the uncertain hope that mail might reach across the Pacific, that friendships forged in such unusual circumstances might survive the return to normal life. Thomas Whitmore gave Hiroshi his son's Bible, the one that had been returned with his effects, and said he thought his son would have approved, would have wanted it to go to someone who would actually read it rather than just let it gather dust on a shelf. Hiroshi accepted it with both hands, bowing deeply, and promised he would treasure it, would use it to remember not just Thomas's generosity but the possibility of reconciliation, of building something other than walls between people. The war had ended, but its echoes would continue, rippling forward through the lives of everyone it had touched. The prisoners who returned to Japan carried with them memories of Texas Sundays, of churches filled with light and music, of elderly women who brought them cookies and asked about their families, of young men who should have hated them but instead tried to learn their language. They carried stories that complicated the simple narratives of victors and vanquished, that suggested the possibility of grace even in the midst of catastrophe. Thomas Whitmore continued his Sunday morning walks through what was now an empty camp, the buildings standing vacant but still haunted by the presence of men who had occupied them. He would stand where he'd first encountered Hiroshi watching the sunrise, would remember how that moment had opened a door in his heart he thought was permanently sealed by grief. He understood now that his son's death would always hurt, that there was no final resolution to that loss, but that the pain could coexist with other feelings, with gratitude for what he'd learned, with hope that the world might eventually learn to stop devouring its children. The small church in Texas continued its services, the pews perhaps more aware of their own capacity to hold contradiction, to accommodate people who shouldn't fit together but somehow did. Reverend Patterson incorporated some of what he'd learned into his preaching, spoke more often about the stranger who might be an angel, about the radical possibility of loving one's enemies not as abstract principle but as daily practice. The congregation listened with the understanding of people who had witnessed something extraordinary, something that couldn't be easily explained but which had changed them nonetheless. Years later, letters would arrive from Japan, carefully written notes that updated families on births and deaths, on rebuilding and recovery, on the slow painful work of creating new lives from the ruins of the old. Hiroshi wrote regularly to Thomas and Mary, described how he'd returned to teaching, how he used that Bible in his classes to teach English, how his students were learning not just a language but the story of how their teacher had been treated with kindness when he'd expected only cruelty. He wrote about taking his own children to church, about trying to pass on what he'd learned in Texas, about the ways that grace, once experienced, became impossible to forget. Mrs. Henderson received a package from Takeshi containing seeds from his garden in Japan, varieties that would probably struggle in the Texas heat but which represented his desire to maintain connection, to continue the exchange they'd begun. She planted them carefully, tended them with the attention she'd once given to teaching him about American plants, and when some of them actually bloomed, she pressed the flowers and sent them back to him with a note that said simply, "Look what we grew." The cookbook that the women had compiled circulated through the community, recipes being tried and adapted, meals being shared that combined traditions in ways that would have seemed impossible before the war. At potlucks and family dinners, dishes appeared that bore witness to what had been learned, to the ways that even in the midst of terrible conflict, human beings had found ways to feed each other, to offer sustenance that was both physical and spiritual. The story of those Sunday church services became a kind of legend in the town, passed down through generations as an example of what community could mean when people chose grace over vengeance, when they recognized that the enemy was never just the enemy but always also a human being with family and fears and the capacity for change. Parents told their children about how their grandparents had sat in church beside Japanese prisoners, had shared coffee and cookies with men whose compatriots had killed their loved ones, had chosen to build bridges instead of maintaining walls. For those who had been there, who had lived through those Sundays, the memories retained a particular vividness, a luminous quality that ordinary memories lacked. They would remember specific moments with crystalline clarity, the way light fell through the church windows, the sound of hymns sung in 2 languages, the taste of Mrs. Patterson's pies, the feeling of shaking hands with someone who had been designated as enemy but who felt in that moment simply like another person trying to survive with dignity intact. These memories became treasured possessions, evidence that even in the darkest times, even when the world seemed committed to its own destruction, there remained the possibility of choosing differently, of creating small pockets of grace that could sustain hope. The camp itself was eventually demolished, the buildings torn down and the land returned to other purposes, but its legacy persisted in less tangible ways. The people who had participated in those Sunday services carried something forward, a knowledge that borders between people were more permeable than they seemed, that the category of enemy could be transcended, that the work of being human required constant choosing between the easier path of hatred and the harder path of compassion. They had learned that grace was not passive acceptance but active choice, made again and again, in moments large and small, in the decision to offer coffee to someone who should be your enemy, to learn someone's language, to share your grief in your grandmother's recipe for apple pie. Thomas Whitmore, in his final years, would sit in his usual pew on Sunday mornings, feeling the presence of all the people who had passed through that space, the accretion of prayers and songs and small kindnesses that had soaked into the wood and stone. He would think about his son, about Hiroshi and the other prisoners, about the strange alchemy that had transformed his grief into something that, while never exactly healing, had at least become bearable, had found purpose and meaning in the connections he'd helped facilitate. He understood that his son's death would never make sense, could never be justified or explained, but that from that senseless loss had grown something unexpected, a kind of bitter fruit that nonetheless contained seeds of hope. The last time Hiroshi visited, many years after the war had ended, he came with his own son, wanting to show the boy where his father had learned what it meant to be treated as human when the world had decided he was less than that. They stood together in the church, now elderly men, Thomas and Hiroshi, and remembered those Sundays when everything had seemed uncertain, when each week had felt like a small rebellion against the logic of war. They didn't talk much, had passed beyond the need for extensive conversation, but stood together in comfortable silence, two men who had found in each other something precious, some confirmation that despite everything, despite all the evidence to the contrary, human beings were capable of transcending their worst impulses, of choosing connection over division, of building communities that acknowledged the full complexity of what it meant to be human. The story of those Sunday services, of Japanese prisoners invited to church with Texans, remained as testament to the possibility of grace, to the ways that even small acts of kindness could ripple forward through time, affecting people and places far beyond their immediate context. It demonstrated that the work of peace was not grand gestures but accumulated small choices, made in moments when hatred would have been easier and more justified, to see the person rather than the enemy, to offer coffee and cookies and conversation, to sing together even when the words were in different languages, to believe that the space between people could be bridge rather than chasm if only you were willing to build carefully, patiently, with materials as simple as attention and respect. And the stubborn refusal to accept that enmity was the only possible relationship between former enemies. And so the story persisted, passed from one generation to the next, not as simple morality tale but as complicated truth, as reminder that human beings contain multitudes, that we are capable of both the worst atrocities and the most unexpected grace, that the choice between these possibilities is made not once but constantly, in small moments that seem insignificant but which accumulate into the shape of a life, the character of a community, the possibility of a world where enemies can become friends, where Sunday mornings in a small Texas church can become laboratories for a different kind of human relationship, where the simple act of inviting someone to worship beside you becomes radical practice of the grace you claim to believe in, where coffee and cookies and hymns sung together become the infrastructure of reconciliation, where strangers become neighbors and then friends and finally something more profound, people who have seen each other clearly and chosen connection despite every reason to choose otherwise, who have built together something fragile and precious and true.